Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Colwell, the Director of Telecom Strategy, and today I'm with John Schwartz, the President of Voqal, and we're here to talk about Spectrum Marketplace developments. Before we get started, we want to tell you a little bit about Voqal. Voqal is a collaboration of 5 nonprofit entities that hold EBS, or Educational Broadband Service licenses, which are in the 2.5 gigahertz range. As part of our organization, we track developments in spectrum, and today we're going to tell you a little bit about that. A few notes before we get going. Today's presentation is an adaptation of one we made to our own boards recently. If the vocabulary is not familiar to you, you might want to check out another video of Spectrum Basics, which we have also developed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to John. John, what's happening in the Spectrum Marketplace?
Well, a lot's happening. Let me just mention that this is recorded on December 3rd, 2020. This presentation will be different really every week. We probably will do some updates, but if you tune in next January or February, more things will have evolved as we explain. So let's start with who's got what, because the marketplace has a lot to do with demand, and demand has to do with what major wireless carriers want, at least in big cities. So this is a slide of the spectrum holdings as they existed before T-Mobile acquired Sprint. So to find out what T-Mobile has now, and T-Mobile is the biggest user of 2.5 gigahertz spectrum, you have to add these things together. The orange color is what is known as low band spectrum. And if that doesn't make sense to you, as Mark said, we have a Spectrum Basics presentation. And then the green and the purple are both different types of midband. So you could see that before the merger, Sprint was king of midband, and all of that has been added to the midband spectrum that T-Mobile had. Now, in comparison, Verizon has a relatively weak midband position, and AT&T is somewhat better. Dish, on the other hand, has quite a bit of midband. Dish is supposed to be the fourth entrant in the national wireless marketplace as a result of deals that were done when T-Mobile and Sprint merged. They have not really emerged as a significant provider yet, but they do have a big spectrum position. This is a slide which was filed with the FCC by Verizon. Verizon is starting to get kind of cranky about the lead of spectrum that T-Mobile has. Now, this red horizontal line is something that's known as the spectrum screen. It's a concept derived by the FCC, and it's basically a third of the holdings of major carriers. As you can see, T-Mobile considerably exceeds the current screen, whereas AT&T and Verizon are rather distant second and third, and then here's Dish. Now this is exclusively low band spectrum and mid band spectrum. There's another band known as millimeter wave, which is very abundant but has really limited capabilities. It's excluded from this slide. And again, if you want to know more about the types of spectrum, millimeter wave, mid-band, and low band, I refer you to our Spectrum Basics presentation. So now there are a lot of metaphors that people use when they're talking about spectrum. And with apologies to any vegetarians, I'm going to use the metaphor of spectrum as steak. And there are a couple of major dimensions when you've got a steak. One is how big the steak is in terms of how much the plate it will occupy, and the other is the thickness of the steak. So when we apply this to wireless, the geographic size is how much of the plate it occupies, and the thickness is how much contiguous spectrum there is. The FCC has sold licenses according to many different units of geography, and this slide shows a number of them that they have used, and there are different levels of thickness. The 100 megahertz thickness is really available only to T-Mobile in mid-band under certain circumstances and at millimeter wave. It's not widely available. And as we'll show with some diagrams, some spectrum is paired where there are, if you buy spectrum, you get some upstream spectrum and some paired downstream, and others is unpaired. This is important because, you know, we're on the dawn of the 5G era. And if you run 5G on narrow channel widths, it really isn't any faster than LTE. So to get the full benefit of 5G, you need a thick piece of steak. Now, these are pictures of some of the geographic units taken from the FCC. Cellular market areas have been used as a unit for spectrum auctions. All of the things we're going to look at are accumulations of counties. And you'll notice that in the Western United States in particular, cellular market areas tend to be larger. Partial economic areas are another unit. We're right on the cusp today in December of 2020 of a major mid-band auction in what's called C-band, and we'll talk more about this. The C-band auction is going to be based on partial economic areas, so it's got a lot of interest now. Again, Western partial economic areas tend to be larger than those in the East. This is one of the largest units that the FCC has used, called regional economic area groupings, also referred to as REAGs. REAGs were very popular and spectrum was sold at good prices. Typically, it's going to be your large national carriers that are going to want to buy REAGs. And of course, they have a lot of money, so they can pump a lot into buying spectrum under REAG geographic units. Now, this main focus of this is the educational broadband service. We're interested in this, of course, because Voqal holds licenses in that band. And EBS follows none of these rules. This is a picture of our license in the Philadelphia area. It's based on a 35-mile radius from a geographic center point, which happens to be the antenna farm in Philadelphia's Roxborough neighborhood. But, you know, other licenses are nearby and they can overlap. And in that case, they have a cord, they split this football, as they say, and you lose some territory. Now, the black lines, the small black lines, are counties. So we've got all of Philadelphia County. I think this is Montgomery County. We've got all of that, all of Chester County. Or maybe that's Delaware County, not real sure of my geography there. But anyway, unlike all those other groupings, this does not follow county boundaries. Now, here is a picture of our Indianapolis license, where there are lots of surrounding EBS systems, and there are lots of footballs split, so that, you know, the entire boundary of this is determined by the cords that split footballs. So the main message is there's not a uniform license size for EBS either, because you might get the benefit of a full 35-mile radius, but in major parts of the country, you're going to be limited by nearby licenses that are going to limit the size of your area. Now, okay, so that's the plate size for various types of licenses, including EBS. Now we're looking at the thickness of the steak. This is AWS-3, which is a very popular mid-band source of mid-band spectrum. It has paired spectrum. One part of it is in the 1700 megahertz band, and one part of it is in the 2.1 megahertz band. So there's quite a lot of separation between the upstream and the downstream. This here is the, let's see, mobile transmits, the upstream spectrum, goes from your cell phone to the base station. And here's a pair for you. The G block has 15 megahertz of upstream and 15 megahertz of downstream. The next unit, this is not to scale, is much smaller. You've only got 5 megahertz of upstream and 5 megahertz of downstream. it is very difficult for carriers to accumulate all of the AWS band. So the chances are that they'll have chunks of it and not have others. So the prospects of really getting a very thick, juicy steak at AWS3 are not good. But the spectrum is widely used by a number of carriers, and it's very popular in the US. Now, this is PCS. This spectrum was given out in the 90s, way before broadband was much of a thing. It is also involves paired spectrum. The main use of this was cell phones for voice. The A block here gives you 15 megahertz paired with 15 megahertz. Again, the separation between the two bands is smaller than with AWS. But again, it is hard to get a lot of contiguous spectrum in the PCS band. All the major carriers hold at least some PCS spectrum. And that means that nobody is going to have all of this spectrum. Another factor that spectrum watchers use is they track what's happening in recent spectrum auctions. And there is one that's already been finished, and there's one that's forthcoming. I'm going to pass this back to Mark to talk about. Oh, actually, no, wait a minute. This is still me. Mark will be joining us to talk about the spectrum auctions. These are some historic figures of spectrum auctions. These are mostly mid-band. The only exception is this 700 megahertz band, which is a low band auction comp. These, unfortunately, are not put in chronological order. And if they were, I think what you would see is a jagged set of ups and downs. AWS3 is a relatively recent spectrum auction. I think that was 2015, 700 megahertz, fairly recent here. Some of the PCS auctions, do go back decades. And this is a price per megahertz pop. Again, if megahertz pop is not something you're familiar with, our Spectrum Basics course explains what a megahertz pop is, but it's the main unit according to which spectrum is leased and sold, just kind of like bananas are sold by the pound. Our unit of measure is megahertz pops. Now, this is an interesting graph because it shows pricing per population density. If you're in a major market, Chicago, just to pick one arbitrarily, obviously your spectrum is going to be worth more because there are more people that live there, but it's also worth more per capita, as this shows. This is the AWS3 auction, went for an average price of $266, but that does not display the fact that it went for nearly $5 in very dense areas and went for just pennies in rural areas. This is the 700 megahertz band. It's a little more constant. The 700 megahertz is low band, and low band is useful in rural areas because it goes so far. And so the pricing didn't start as high, but it didn't drop as low when it was auctioned off. Now, I'm going to pass this back to Mark to talk about the Citizens Band radio service auction, which just concluded recently.
Thanks, John. So we're going to talk about a very unique spectrum band, Citizens Broadband Radio Service. The auction actually took place in summer of 2020. And what's unique about it is that it's a shared band. Traditionally, spectrum is either unlicensed, meaning it's like your Wi-Fi or your Bluetooth, where anyone whose equipment is operating under the FCC Part 15 rules can use the spectrum, or it's exclusive use spectrum, where one entity holds the license and can choose what to do with it. They can lease it or they can build their own system on it. Well, CBRS is different. And the reason it's different is that there are some incumbents that use this spectrum. One of them being the US Navy. So along the coasts where the Navy operates, occasionally they're going to have a ship near you and the spectrum will be occupied. But in the middle of the country where there's less Navy operations, this stuff is generally going to be more open. So the way it works is there's a computer system, a computer database called a SAS that will tell a user whether or not there's an incumbent using the spectrum. The FCC sought to auction off a second tier. So the incumbents are the first tier. Then they auctioned off what's known as a priority access license. So those are the folks that get access to this spectrum next. And then finally, there's a third use. If there's no one else using the spectrum, a third group of users can use it. This is one of the first auctions where they used counties as the geographic metric. And actually, we're going to talk about a 2.5 gigahertz band where, you know, that could be something the FCC looks at doing. They've proposed that at least. But counties is a relatively small geographic unit. In reference or in relation to the other midband that I just mentioned, 2.5, 3.5 is a little higher frequency, so it doesn't travel quite as far. It has unusually low power limits, about 10 times lower than the 2.5 band. And the FCC sought to license this in 10 megahertz channels. And on the next slide, we'll give you a few examples of how the auction was set up. So the FCC sold 7 10 megahertz wide chunks of this spectrum. So one of the rules they had in the auction is they didn't want any one entity to buy all of it. So they limited a maximum of 4 licenses in any given county. And while analysts predicted, because of the limitations of this ban, they predicted a price of about $15 billion raised. It actually raised a little bit more, $21 billion. And one reason for that is that Verizon has a particularly bad spectrum position, I guess I would say, and they needed this stuff now. They're kind of maxed out on the existing spectrum assets they have. And this can be used for 4G LTE almost immediately. So the average price nationwide for the spectrum was about 21 cents. And as you'll see on the next slide, Verizon typically bought 3 or 4 chunks of this, 10 megahertz wide chunks of this in the most populous counties of the country, but they often didn't bid in the suburban counties. So Dish and local cable operators bought the other slices and then bought a lot of the suburban stuff. So the top spenders in the CBRS auction, Verizon spent $1.89 billion, but they only won 557 licenses. Again, the most populous counties in the country. And again, 3 or 4 in those counties. Dish Network, on the other hand, spent about half that, but got 10 times as many licenses at 5,492. And then the cable companies, where they have service, typically bought up licenses both in the urban area and the suburban area. Interestingly, the last entity on this list is Southern California Edison, and they spent $118 million to get 20 licenses. That's actually one of the reasons that CBRS was an experimental ban. They wanted to get more users, diversity of users into the band, but it looks like traditional spectrum license holders bid for most of the spectrum here. We took a look at selected marketplaces to see what the pricing looked like. And so here's a variety of different markets. And actually the pricing varies pretty dramatically. You'll notice in Chicago, it went for about 76 cents a megahertz pop. In Denver County, it's the highest on this list, $1.13 per megahertz pop. Now, we have some perhaps speculation about why that occurred. Dish Network, who again, John mentioned will be the 4th wireless entrant, has their headquarters in Denver County, and perhaps they bid very fiercely against Verizon for those licenses. But you'll notice other major metropolitan areas like Minneapolis, they came in actually below the national average at about 20 cents. And Kansas City was just 10 cents a megahertz pop. The average for these more populous counties was about 45 cents, which is double the average for the national. And you'll see a reason why it averaged out lower on the next slide. We took a deeper dive at that.
Before we go to the next slide, Mark, why did these prices vary so greatly? You know, from about 10 cents at Kansas City to over $1.10 at Denver.
One of the reasons is that CBRS has limitations, as we mentioned. First of all, you're sharing spectrum. Second of all, the geographic coverage is pretty limited. I've talked to some folks who have built fixed wireless systems using CBRS, and they say that the radius that they can cover is about 0.7 to 0.9 miles. So if you're Verizon bidding on this spectrum, it's going to take a lot of equipment and a lot of build out to cover what's required by the FCC in terms of geography. So you might only want to do that in a dense urban area where you've got enough users to profit. If you're doing that in a larger geographic county that's maybe less populated, it may be harder to hit your build out requirements, but there may also be a lot of expense to do that and not a lot of users. So we took a deeper look at this Denver market because it was the highest in the of that list that we showed you. And this is a good example of what we saw kind of in other areas as well. So we've got about, I don't know, about 6 or 7 counties on the list here. In Denver County specifically, Verizon won 3 licenses and the average price was $1.13 per megahertz pop. But you'll notice in the surrounding counties around Denver, such as Jefferson or Adams, the prices were much, much lower, 2 to 5 cents per megahertz pop. And you'll notice that Dish Network won Boulder County for just 2 cents. They won 4 slices of CBRS. Comcast won 4 in Arapahoe County. The only other county Verizon bid in was Broomfield County, where they won 4, but they paid a much lower price at just 3 cents a megahertz pop. This is pretty typical of what happened kind of all over metro areas. Verizon bid heavily in the most populous area, and then the cable and Dish Network bid in the suburban counties. So the big enchilada is coming up here in December, and that's the C-band auction. The C-band is another slice of mid-band. It sits a little bit higher than CBRS at 3.7 gigahertz to 4.2 gigahertz. Today, the C-band is used for satellite service. So it's a 500 megahertz slice. And the FCC has a fairly novel approach to this. Their plan is to move the existing satellite users from the lower part of the band to the upper part of the band by launching new satellites and adding filters to existing satellite systems. They're going to put a 20 megahertz guard band in between the lower part, which will be for wireless, terrestrial wireless, and the satellite part up above that. But in total, the FCC is going to have 280 megahertz of spectrum to sell. They're going to sell it in 20 megahertz wide slices, and they're going to have 14 of those to sell. The geographic unit, as John mentioned, will be partial economic area. So it's a pretty large collection of counties in most cases. And generally, the carriers like larger units. And we think the expected revenue that we've seen in the press reports will be somewhere between $50 and $70 billion. But there's a lot of factors that might influence that. So on the next slide, we've got from New Street Research, we've got a couple of scenarios that might play out. One is where demand would exceed supply, and on the next slide we'll show you what it looks like if there's less demand. One important feature is that the lower 100 megahertz of this spectrum will be available to use next December. So that's probably going to fetch a higher price because you can use it more quickly, and the next 180 megahertz will not be available because they've got to launch satellites, for instance, until 2023. So while they're selling it this December, it's not going to be operational until next December and thereafter. But you'll notice there's about 100 megahertz of the lower block, 180 of the upper block, and we've also got CBRS on this to show you kind of the total supply coming to the market here in 2020, 350 megahertz. In this scenario, on the slide, on the part of the slide to the right, it shows what would be, kind of the high level projections for demand. Verizon might want 200 megahertz total. Now you'll notice from the CBRS, they've already purchased 30 or 40 in most of the populous counties. The T there actually stands for AT&T. They might want 140 megahertz. And then T-Mobile, while they have really good mid-band holdings, they sure don't want the other guys to get all of this spectrum. So they might want to buy 100 megahertz, Dish another 100 megahertz, and then cable. And the other category typically is hedge funds and private equity groups that might want to buy it. So this is sort of a excess excess demand slide of what could happen. And if we saw that, we might see really high pricing. The next slide shows you what happens if demand falls short of supply. So again, you've got the 350 megahertz available on the left, but on the right, this time the price gets really high. Verizon gets their 100, AT&T buys 40 because it gets expensive. T-Mobile figures, wow, this is really expensive and we've already got a lot of mid-band. Maybe we sit it out. Same with Dish. They have a pretty robust spectrum portfolio. Maybe they don't buy some. And that in this scenario where you get a low demand, you might see lower pricing. Now, I would project that that's probably not going to happen, but we will have to see as the auction starts in December. I'm going to hand it back over to John to talk about EBS spectrum marketplace developments because that's an important mid-band.
So let's talk about the EBS band. Once again, it follows none of the rules. Typically, these are given out in lettered blocks. So if you get the A channel block of EBS, you would get A1 through A3. This is in what's called the lower band segment because the frequencies are lower. You would get 6 megahertz in this mid-band segment. And on top of that, as a bonus, you get 1 megahertz in the J block, which was originally intended essentially as a guard band, not to be used, but now more and more is an important part of usage. Now, EBS is represented by the salmon-colored frequencies. The green and the blue are broadband radio service, BRS, and BRS is a commercial band. In major markets, T-Mobile owns essentially all of the BRS. So there's good and there's bad news here. This is a lot of spectrum. It's almost 200 megahertz worth of spectrum from top to bottom. The catch is that it is hard to get sufficient contiguity. So you could get a hugely thick piece of steak, or if you miss, for example, the C block, well, you would have contiguity from BRS1 through the end of B3, but you'd miss out on the C block. You would have a barrier here. You would miss out on the C block here. It really, there's no way to get 100 megahertz in the lower or mid-band segment if you're missing that one channel group. So there really is a premium if you want 100 megahertz, for example, which is a very thick, very useful amount of steak. It's doable, but it's hard to do in our band. So T-Mobile is dominant in the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum band. And we saw that in one of the early bar graphs where they have an awful lot of mid-band, and that mostly comes from the 2.5 gigahertz band, which is EBS and BRS. So they own BRS licenses, and they lease about 1,500 different EBS leases for those little smaller chunks of geography that we saw earlier. Now, the FCC changed the rules for EBS. It was limited to governmental and nonprofit licensees previously, but starting in late April of this year, they allowed the sale of EBS licenses. So T-Mobile, as we'll cover more, is starting to do some purchases. So T-Mobile controls an average of 160 megahertz in the top 100 markets. As you can see from the prior slide, the layout does matter because 160 megahertz doesn't necessarily give you a steak that's 160 megahertz thick. There are some major markets where they control all 194 megahertz, and those are listed here. And there's some other places where they didn't come out as well for various historic reasons. Las Vegas, New York City, San Francisco are examples of cities where they do control substantial amounts of spectrum, but not nearly up to their average. Now, EBS, because it's given out in these little circular or less than circular geographic sizes, does not cover the whole country. And the areas where it doesn't reach is known in our jargon as white space. So about 50% of territory is licensed, and this tends to be the most populous area. So it's the vast bulk of US population. But there are other spaces. Now we've got a great map here. The darkest red colors are areas where all of the spectrum has been given out. Again, you see that that is more common in the eastern US and in the more populous areas. If you go to the darkest orange, almost all of it's given out. And then the lighter and lighter the color is, the less of it's given out. And where you can see the underlying map, that's complete white space. There is no EBS spectrum that's been allotted there, again, primarily in the Western US and primarily in sparse areas. So we took a couple of the areas where vocal organizations have spectrum. This is Chicago, and you can see the underlying counties. The fact that there's a smooth edge here means, at least on these frequencies, there's no immediately adjacent EBS license. So on the other side, this is 35 miles from the Sears Tower in downtown Chicago. When you go 35 miles out, there's a little bit of white space. This is Philadelphia. Later map, you may recall it was only one overlap that we showed you before. There are actually two. This shows both of them. So there's no white space on the other side of these cords, but out here where there's a circular area, there is white space. Now, there's not a lot of white space because here's another licensee, and here's one here. So you get these kind of crescent shaped scraps of geography. If the FCC goes through with its plans to auction EBS white space, we don't think that very many parties are going to be interested, except for T-Mobile, because again, why would you come in if you're a competing carrier and get part of Berks County? It's not really very attractive from that standpoint. Now, before starting on the white space, which we expect will be auctioned, the FCC conducted a tribal priority window. This is for rural tribal lands. They've started to issue licenses that came in during that application window. We are expecting several hundred tribal licenses. And although there has been no EBS auction slated, it's expected in the middle of next year. This is going to be based on counties also. There is a completely different band plan for the white space versus the allocated space. There are only going to be 3 licenses that are given out. And as we covered, this is mostly in suburban and rural places. And then there's a big debate going on right now before the FCC about how the auction should be conducted. T-Mobile supports having what's called a multi-round auction, which is the most common method that the FCC has used, where you get to keep bidding. And this would be favorable to T-Mobile because they have the capability probably of outbidding any likely rival. But smaller entities have been favoring having one round. It's like a sealed bid auction for a piece of artwork. You submit your bid, you're the high bid, you win. There have been no auction rules established and no auction rules proposed as of yet. There is an eternal debate that goes on between spectrum users and spectrum aggregators about who is the source of the most value. The aggregators, the T-Mobiles of the world, say, hey, a little bit of spectrum here or there isn't worth anything. What's really worth something is the fact that we've assembled so much of it. That gives it its value. Licensees like us, that rubs us a little bit the wrong way, but it is certainly a point of view. The broadcast incentive auction was the 600 megahertz auction. We haven't had any stats on that, but that was a very interesting auction where the FCC simultaneously took bids from wireless companies to buy spectrum, and it issued bids to broadcasters who were interested to sell their spectrum. This concluded successfully. Most of the money ended up being paid to the licensees. So it was you could chalk one up primarily to licensees as the source of value. In that case, it's not clear that the dynamics in EBS would be the same as that, however. So we are starting to see some announced EBS transactions, and we have updated it through December, but there's a continuous flow of these transactions all the time. T-Mobile has bought more than 40 licenses. Typically, they're in smaller areas, but there are some exceptions. And the thing that has our little subworld agog is the Los Angeles deal, where just announced this month is the purchase of 8 channels from the University of Southern California, which is a major EBS licensee in the LA area. Most of those cover Los Angeles. One set covers Orange County. Now, there is a rival bidder. This is a company called Sonic Wave. It is funded by private equity. They have been purchasing and leasing EBS spectrum, again, typically in more rural or ex-urban areas. Their biggest deals have both been leases where they leased 2 licenses from the Birmingham Board of Ed, and Daytona Beach, where they leased 4 licenses from Daytona College, a state entity. Normally, lease terms are not public. They have confidentiality clauses in them. But when public entities are involved, often sunshine laws require the disclosure of lease terms. So, Voqal has been running around trying to check out on the values of some of these Sonic Wave and T-Mobile deals. We have ascertained that there was a purchase deal in Lincoln, Nebraska at 29 cents per megahertz pop. And then the lease terms for the Daytona College deal were about 28 cents per megahertz pop. So you ask yourself, why are these prices as they are? Because obviously there have been mid-band deals that have been much more lucrative, and then mid-band deals in attractive bands, especially in rural areas, that have been less so. So on the negative side, it is hard to get a big geographic footprint or a thick, juicy piece of steak in a single EBS deal. This tends to justify the argument for the aggregation as being the primary source of value. T-Mobile is, of course, the principal aggregator. And so far, no other major carrier has entered the 2.5 gigahertz market to date. On the other side, 2.5 gigahertz is an internationally standardized frequency band for broadband. And therefore, the chipsets that go into cellular devices now have 2.5 built into them in most cases. So that is a real barrier for some bands that are less used globally, but it certainly suggests that if a major carrier wanted to come in and start competing with T-Mobile for spectrum deals, that they could make use of the band immediately. And as Mark has described, spectrum today is worth a lot more than spectrum that you can't get access to in the future. Now, Voqal has leases on its spectrum. They don't expire for about 15 more years. I think that's fairly typical of EBS leases that were entered into in large numbers about 15 years ago. So we look ahead and we ask ourselves, what's spectrum going to be like in mid-band 15 years from now? The fact is, I don't think anybody has the answer to that. 15 years is a long time in wireless. We do expect a lot more spectrum sharing of the type that CBRS exemplifies, and perhaps even more sophisticated spectrum sharing as time goes on. So that could create new markets for EBS. And it may be that the current emphasis on very big geographic units and on very large amounts of spectrum may not be the case when you go out 10, 15 years when a lot of EBS leases expire. On the other hand, that is a more flexible and more efficient use of spectrum. There really has been a chronic shortage of spectrum in the United States over the last 20, 30 years. It's what accounts for such large valuations. Much more effective use of spectrum could eliminate that shortage. So it could be that 15 years from now, spectrum, it isn't in the desperately needed category that it is today. Anyway, that is our presentation for now as of December 2020. As you can see, there's a lot in play here. We'll have more information. There'll be more deals in the 2.5 gigahertz band. We'll know how the C-band auction came out. And there's always possibilities for transactions that haven't been announced yet that could change the marketplace a lot. So we'll sometime in 2021, we plan to update this.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks for everyone watching. If you want to learn more about Voqal, you can check out voqal.org, and you can find the slides there as well.